Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Sheldon Chambers and I will be joined by writer and commentator William Duguid. First, we will
Hello.
be... Hello. But first we will be turning to our Ukrainian update. Russia is ready to hand over to Ukraine the bodies from a military plane crash in January, according to the Russia State RIA news agency, which cited human rights official Tatiana Mosklovokova. Russia accused Ukrainian of shooting down the Ilyushin Tu-76 plane in Russia's Belgorod region and said all 74 on board were killed, including 65 captured Ukrainian soldiers en route to a prisoner swap. Russia has not presented evidence. Ukraine has neither confirmed nor denied it shot down the plane and has challenged Moscow's account of the events, including who and what were on board. Ukraine's military said on Thursday it had shot down 3 more Russian Su-34 fighter bombers, continuing a string of successes. Army Chief Alexander Syrsky said that Ukrainian forces have pushed back Russian troops from the village of Orlivka, west of Avdiivka, but the situation on the Eastern Front remained difficult. Syrsky said the Russian army was trying to seize towns and villages in the eastern Donetsk region, where Ukraine said they would form a new line of defense after pulling out of Avdiivka on the 17th of February. The Ukrainian military has said that Russia carried out dozens of shelling attacks on border territories and settlements in Sumy Oblast on Thursday. The Russian President Vladimir Putin said the West is attempting to destroy us and to contain our development in his annual address to Parliament. Putin said Western countries risked provoking a nuclear war if they sent troops to fight in Ukraine. The US said nuclear war is a familiar threat raised by Putin regime, but there are no signs of Russia preparing to use such weapon. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had appointed Vladimir Karapenko as new commander of Ukrainian logistic forces, according to presidential decree. Jack Teixeira, the Massachusetts Air National Guard member accused of leaking highly classified military documents on social media, including information about Ukraine's air defences, is expected to plead guilty according to court papers. European defence and foreign ministers would meet in Paris in coming days to discuss further support for Ukraine and Moldova. Ukraine has identified 511 people suspected of war crimes since Russia's February 2022 invasion and has already handed down 81 convictions, and Prosecutor General Andriy Kostin said in Kyiv on Thursday. Ukraine planned to export a high volume of electricity on Thursday, taking advantage of lower domestic consumption during a spell of mild weather, the energy ministry said. On Thursday, a Russian court rejected an appeal by Russian-American woman Kassina Karolina against her detention on a treason charge. The FSB security service says she has been detained on suspicion of raised funds for Ukraine's armed forces. Sri Lanka has decided to stop issuing free long-term visas to Russia and Ukrainian nationals who have lived there for the past 2 years, a government official has said. William, how important is it that Russia actually makes some gains before the next general election in the next couple of weeks?
I think Russia will always be wanting to make gains. I do think that uh, public opinion in Russia is perhaps not as pro-war as Putin might like it to be, and maybe some successes will make things look a bit better from his perspective. But he's got already in his pocket, having taken Avdiivka just in the last couple of weeks. So I don't think he'll feel under any great pressure. But if we look at some of the things that went on at the Navalny funeral, or seem to have gone on, and I know we'll be saying more about that later. But that would indicate that Putin doesn't totally have support for what's going on. So, yeah, success may well help in that regard, but I wouldn't think it's an absolute priority for him.
Thank you. We're going to turn now to our Israel and Gaza update. At least 30,228 Palestinians have been killed and 71,377 have been injured in Israel's military offense in Gaza since the 7th of October. The Gaza Health Ministry said in a statement, the ministry gave the total casualties in the past 24 hours as 193 Palestinians killed and 920 injured, which included those killed or hurt in the aid convoy incident. Germany and France have joined widespread condemnation of the deaths of over 100 Palestinians yesterday while they were gathered to receive humanitarian aid in Gaza during an incident in which Israeli troops opened fire. Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock demanded that Israel's army fully explained the mass panic and shooting could have happened, while her French counterpart Stéphane Séjourné said that there will have to be an independent probe to determine what happened. Earlier, French President Emmanuel Macron said he felt deep indignation at the images coming from Gaza where civilians have been targeted by Israeli soldiers. Israel's military have denied shooting into large crowds of hungry people and said most were killed in a crush or run over by trucks trying to escape. In the US, the White House called the deaths tremendously alarming. Brazil's government said the killing shows that the Israel military action in Gaza has no ethical or legal limits. In its latest operational briefing, Israel's military says it continues to operate in Khan Yunis, where it claims to have located a weapons storage facility containing numerous AK-47 rifles and ammunition. Egypt's Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry said that he is still hopeful that talks initiated by Qatar can agree a cessation of hostilities before the start of Ramadan. A demonstration has taken place outside the US Embassy in Tel Aviv, calling for President Biden's administration to do more to help free the 134 hostages still believed to be held in Gaza by Hamas. Nearly 20,000 worshippers were able to reach the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Friday's prayers, despite significant restrictions on the entry of worshippers imposed by Israeli security forces. There were arrests and some worshippers were denied entry and forced to pray outside the compound. World Health Organization spokesperson Christian Lindemir has said that the health system in Gaza is more than on its knees, and he also cautioned people not to forget that food supplies to the territory had been cut off deliberately. Jordan's Air Force has been airdropping humanitarian aid into Gaza Strip today. The EU has said it will resume funding to the UN Relief and Work Agency for Palestine next week, after the two parties came to the agreement to allow EU-appointed experts to audit the way it screens staff to identify extremists. UN investigators say that they have yet to receive any evidence from Israel to support claims of the UNRWA's involvement in October the 7th. So, William, as the pressure mounts on Israel on the international community for a ceasefire, can the UK still continue to keep its support unwavering for them?
Well, I wonder. They're certainly having a good shot at it, aren't they? It was interesting with the definite unease that all sorts of nations, including the US and Germany, as well as France, are now expressing about the aid convoy deaths yesterday, however those were caused. And to be honest, it doesn't really matter whether Israel was shooting at them or whether it was a crush. It was a crush caused by desperation if it was a crush, and that itself has been caused by the conduct of this war by Israel. So, where is the UK condemnation that is the same as being expressed by Germany, France, and the US, and many, many other countries? We don't know. and it still sees international leaders. And you ask how long it can go on. I'm sometimes amazed by how long Rishi Sunak can go on clinging to particular positions. But there must come a point where the worm turns, and I think that could be fairly soon.
Thank you very much. We're now going to turn to Scotland, where a poll shows that the SNP has increased its Westminster lead. A new poll of 1,043 people in Scotland has shown that the SNP has increased its lead over every other party for the Westminster elections. The Salvation poll from Quantum Communications showed the SNP had widened its national lead with support for the SNP in Westminster voting intentions at 38%. Scottish Labour has slipped to 33% and the Conservatives have also slumped to 15%. The SNP support has grown by 2 points, while Labour has lost 1 since the last Scottish general election poll in January. The Tories are predicted to win just 15% of the votes in Scotland, their lowest vote share since Liz Truss was Prime Minister. Commenting, SNP Deputy Leader Kenneth Brown said, "It's encouraging to see It's encouraging to see people continue to put their trust in the SNP to deliver for the people of Scotland. But we won't take a single vote for granted, and we will keep working hard to stand up and protect Scotland's values. Westminster is not working for Scotland. The cost of living crisis is hammering Scottish households, and neither the Labour nor the Tories are offering any alternative to broken Brexit Britain. At the upcoming election, a vote for the SNP is a vote to choose a brighter future where the decisions that affect the people of Scotland are taken in a Scotland with independence." William, should Labour be concerned with this poll?
I think Labour should be concerned with quite a lot that's going on at the minute, and this poll will certainly figure in that thinking. I wouldn't be just desperately premature about it. It looks pretty good for the SNP compared to what we've seen just in recent months, and compared to other Survation polls, it's showing the biggest lead for the SNP in any Survation poll for, I think, the last 10 months. But there is always a margin for error, and when your sample is 1,043, then that's about 3%. So they might be able to write it off, and they might be looking at other polls to see how they look. Survation does tend to be, according to pollster James Kelly, one of the more favourable polling organisations for the SNP. So, yes, I think Labour should be concerned, and certainly Labour in Scotland should be concerned about its constant undermining by Keir Starmer and the rest of the Westminster elite. They really are looking like a branch office more and more at the minute. I think, though, there's still a lot of work for the SNP to do truly to regain the public trust. And one thing that they might look at is to hammer away at the fact that Labour have embraced Brexit now. And amongst Remain voters in Scotland, there isn't as much of a lead for the SNP as you would expect in that subsample. And that's something that perhaps Keith Brown and his colleagues could be concentrating on to make Labour even more worried.
Thank you. We're now going to turn to the recent by-election in Rochdale. Veteran political agitator George Galloway has declared a shifting of the tectonic plates away from Labour after claiming a stunning victory in the Rochdale by-election. Galloway, one of the most divisive politicians in Britain, won almost 40% of the vote in a contest beset by chaos and controversy and dominated by the conflict in Gaza. He took aim at Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak in a victory speech that was interrupted by hecklers after a dramatic count at the Rochdale Leisure Centre. "Keir Starmer, this is for Gaza," he said. "You will pay a high price for a role that you have been played in enabling, encouraging and covering for the catastrophe presently going on in occupied Gaza in the Gaza Strip." Galloway won 12,335 votes 39.7% of the total, in a much more sweeping victory than anyone had predicted, giving him a 5,697 vote majority. A surprise second place went to David Tully, a local businessman who stood as an independent, saying he would speak up for the town rather than use it as a vehicle for political ambition. Labour, which had abandoned its candidate, Azir Ali, over inflammatory comments he made about Israel, finished in fourth place with just 7.7% of the vote, having held a near 10,000 vote majority in the constituency. Ahead of Ali in third was the Conservative candidate, Paul Ellison, who was barely visible on the campaign trail and is understood to have spent some of the period on holiday. Galloway, an ex-Labour MP, has now unseated his former party in 3 elections and will return to Parliament representing a 4th constituency in 37 years. Galloway's win reflects the findings of a new poll that has shown that a majority of people in Scotland and a significant number across the UK think that Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer have handled the UK's response to the situation in Israel and Palestine badly. The YouGov poll of 2,073 adults in Britain, conducted this week between the 29th of February and the 1st of March, reveals 6 in 10 people in Scotland think Sunak, 61%, and Starmer, 57%, have handled the UK's response badly, compared to just 1 in 10 who think they have handled it well. Across the UK, 4 in 10 people think Sunak, at 43%, and Starmer at 42%, have handled the UK's response badly, compared to 3 in 10, 27%, who think Sunak has handled it well, and 2 in 10, 18%, who think Starmer has handled it well. Labour has been warned about taking the Muslim vote in England for granted, and Galloway's victory undermines this. Is Galloway right in saying that Gaza is going to play a big role in the next general election?
I think it very likely will, although it's probable that it's played a particularly big role in this by-election, more so than it will in the subsequent general election. This by-election is, as all by-elections are, a vehicle for protest, and the protest is quite high at the minute about Gaza, and George Galloway obviously was seen by the Rochdale electorate, or a significant proportion of them, as being on the right side of that argument, certainly unlike the Labour Party, who disowned their candidate for statements that he'd made, whatever you may think of those statements, or indeed anybody else. But as to where we'll be when we get to the general election, whenever that is, a lot of that will depend on what's happened in Gaza, whether the UK has changed its tune at all, and whether we've actually begun to move towards some sort of progress in stopping the war and getting two peoples who have been really unable to share the same patch of land to cooperate with each other and live in peace. A very, very tall order indeed. But if the work is started by the time of the general election, be that May or be it November, then I think Gaza will feature less. If it's still an absolute mess, and particularly the main parties are out of sympathy with the people, or rather the people out of sympathy with them, then I think it will be one of many things that cheese them off considerably. And although you won't necessarily get quite such a maverick result as you just have in Rochdale, you might get some interesting and surprising results throughout the country. And it'll be very interesting to see how Scotland fares in that regard.
Thank you. Do you think that Galloway's election into Parliament is a good thing for the Palestinian problems or the Palestinian struggles?
I don't think it will affect it one way or the other. He will be a voice for them, and he has pledged to be a voice for them. But I think that as a single MP, there's very little he can do. He has spoken out on issues to do with the Middle East over his other incumbencies. It hasn't always gone well for him, but I think he will be a voice, but he won't necessarily always be able to get the voice out, although George Galloway does certainly try to express his views quite trenchantly on many matters.
Thank, thank you very much. We're now going to turn to Westminster, where, the Chancellor has been warned against public service cuts ahead of the next week's spring budget. Jeremy Hunt's scope to make the tax cuts in next week's budget has been reduced further, leaving the Chancellor considering emergency measures to raise revenue. Recent forecasts from the Office of Budget of Responsibility, OBR, has said that to have given the Chancellor less fiscal headroom than hoped, pushing him to consider unexpected tax rises such as abolishing the non-dom tax status. Hunt received the most recent forecast this week and will get another today clarifying how much he plans to spend while remaining on track to meet his self-imposed debt reduction target. The SNP has challenged Jeremy Hunt to boost NHS spending by a minimum of $15 billion in his spring budget, warning Scotland must not pay the price for Tory and Labour Party austerity cuts. With a week until the UK budget, Stephen Flynn MP said protecting Scotland's NHS and public services from Westminster cuts is the SNP's number one priority at the UK budget. The SNP Westminster leader warned Tory and Labour Party plans to slash Scotland's budgets and cut funding for frontline public services are clear and present danger to the Scotland's NHS. The UK government has reduced Scotland's budget by more than $20 billion for this year already, leaving the Scottish government to face a $500 million cut to its block grant and $1.6 billion cut to Scotland's capital budget, in real terms since 2022 and 2023. In total, planned Westminster cuts will reduce Scotland's capital spending power by around 10% over the next 5 years. The Institute of Fiscal Studies has warned the plans outlined in the UK government's autumn statement will mean real-term budget cuts in the region of 3.4% for some of UK departments in the coming year, and Sir Keir Starmer's Labour Party has committed to making similar cuts by saying they will adhere to the Tories' fiscal rules. The SNP has called for a minimum of $15 billion of additional NHS funding made up of $5 billion to address the inflationary pressures of recent years, recognising the NHS spending faces real-term cuts from the Tories. Health Foundation analysis suggests that the NHS England funding was $3.5 billion less in 2023-2024 than it was in 2022-2023 in real terms, and will fall a further $1 billion in 2024 to 2025 under autumn statement plans. $5 billion to help fund the cost of the 2023 to 2024 pay deal in the next fiscal year of 2024 to 2025, since the autumn statement does not include a single penny for these pay deals and treats the cost of the increased pay in the NHS though they were a one-off. $5 billion for improving the NHS performance, recognising the need to invest more to improve services. As a percentage, this is the modest but vital increase. The NHS England budget for 2024 and 2025 is $162.5 billion. The SNP say that their analysis shows that this increase would provide more than $1.2 billion in additional funding for Scotland's NHS through the Barnett consequential. William, this government won its election on plans to level up the whole country. How would these tax cuts actually impact on levelling up?
I don't think they would impact at all on levelling up. I think they would be tax cuts which largely benefited those who are already perfectly wealthy, thank you very much. What will actually create levelling up is a bit of a surge in public spending in the areas that aren't currently receiving it, because public services, particularly in the north of England and by a consequence of Scotland's funding going down in Scotland as well. Maybe it's not as bad in the southeast of England, but public services are on their knees and it's getting worse. Stephen Flynn's concerns are, I think, justified, and there needs to be more money circulating in the economy. And if people are unable to spend money because they don't have money, and inflation has wrecked their finances in the last year, then the government has to spend money. And I simply don't understand how people think tax cuts will actually grease the wheels. What will grease the wheels is money going in to people who will spend it and circulate it thereafter in the economy. So I think it's a completely mistaken view the government has of the way things are working, and I'm actually quite concerned about how the spring budget will turn out next Wednesday.
So do you think that levelling up is dead?
It never really got to life much, did it? So, I think it's a laudable aim if anybody had seriously meant it, because there is a considerable economic disparity between the regions of the UK. But it doesn't seem to me that anybody has seriously attempted it, despite all the rhetoric.
Thank you very much. We're now going to turn to the Scottish Tory conference that happened in Aberdeen. The Scottish Conservative Party Spring Conference is taking place in Aberdeen at the P&J Live Event campus today. In a somewhat brief keynote speech, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak addressed the conference to tell the Scottish branch of the Conservative Party the UK will be needing oil and gas from the Scottish offshore waters for decades to come. On his flying visit to Scotland, Rishi Sunak also visited Moray, Tory leader's constituency, and the Speyside whisky region that houses over 50 distilleries. Ahead of his visit, the SNP challenged the Tory leader to reduce whisky duty by at least 5% in the upcoming UK government spring budget. Whisky accounts for 77% of Scottish food and drinks exports, supports more than 40,000 jobs in Scotland, and generates well over 6 billion in export sales in 2022, and the move could bring in an additional 318 million a year in tax revenues, according to the analysis of the Scotch Whisky Association. Opponents have been quick to point to the low attendance at the Tory conference, while the main event at the venue is Vast Love, a tribute to George Michael. Local SNP MP Richard Thompson said, "Voters in the Scotland have so little faith in Sunak's failing leadership that the Prime Minister has been forced to share a stage at his party conference due to low ticket sales. And no wonder his predecessors' careless whispers tanked the economy, leaving the Tory party simply praying for time until the next general election. With George Michael tributes downstairs and the second-rate Boris Johnson tribute act upstairs, it may not be Club Tropicana at the PJ Live, but we're all too aware of Tories known how to throw an after-hours party." Mr. Thomas said, "Let's tell Rishi Sunak's Tories where to go." So it looks like this general election, both Labour and the Conservatives are really targeting Scotland. How important is Scottish votes going to be in this next general election?
In terms of determining who gets in, historically, Scottish votes have not been important. But it is important that the Scottish people have their say, and that in some way it reflects the mood of the Scottish people. So I don't see a very big Conservative vote under any circumstances. I think the latest poll suggests that's not going to happen. Labour, by contrast, would have hopes and perhaps expectations of considerable gains, and they would see that as important in itself, even if it didn't affect the overall result. I think, again, the polling makes that far from a slam dunk, so we shall just have to see what happens. And again, the spring budget, about which I was expressing my concern a moment ago, may, if received well, impact on the timing of the next general election, because that is an important unknown. We know it's going to happen in the next 10 and a bit months, but we don't know whether it's happening in the spring or whether it's happening in the autumn. The smart money up till now seems to say the autumn, but you never know. The Tories have nothing to lose, and they get to say when it's going to be, and they could well do some sort of handout in terms of perhaps, if not tax cuts, then national insurance cuts in the spring budget, and try to cut and run and salvage what they can. And if they do that, all bets are off. I don't actually think any of the parties is particularly prepared in Scotland for a May general election, but we shall just have to see.
Thank you very much. We're now going to turn to international news. Politicians from 12 countries unite to press for arms ban on Israel. More than 200 MPs from 12 countries have committed themselves to trying to persuade their governments to impose a ban on arms sales to Israel, arguing they will not be complicit in Israel's grave violation of international law in its assault on Gaza. The letter, organised by Progressive International, a network of socialist MPs and activists focused on international justice, is seen as the best practical measure possible to bring public anger over the 30,000 deaths of Palestinians in Gaza into the hearts of Parliament, where calls for an immediate unconditional ceasefire have so far fallen on deaf ears or have been rejected by national governments. The organisers believe governments supplying arms are vulnerable to legal challenges given the scale of devastation in Gaza that they say extends beyond any definition of self-defence or proportionality. The signatories are all MPs in Parliament where the governments allow arms sales to Israel. 9 are current or former leaders of political parties, including former Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn and the leader of the Green Party in Australian Senate, Larissa Walters, the coordinator of France Unbowed, Manuel Bompard, the National Secretary of the Workers' Party of Belgium, Peter Martins, the Canadian MP and member of the Progressive International Council, Nikki Ashton, the Brazilian Federal Deputy Nilton Tato, the former leader of the Die Linke, Bernd Rexinger, the leader of the Spanish party Podemos, Ione Bellaria, the leader of the Dutch Socialist Party, Jimmy Jinks, Irish TD, Thomas Pringle, and the former co-chair of the People's Democratic Party in Turkey, Cesar Tamili. The sole signatory from the US is the Michigan Congresswoman, Rashida Tlaib. In the UK, 39 parliamentarians have signed the letter, including MPs from the Scottish National Party, Labour and the SDLP. The action by the parliamentarians is supported by the founder of France Unbowed, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the Spanish government minister Pablo Bustindio, and the prominent Indian politician Jignesh Meveni. In their letter to the politicians argued that after the International Courts of Justice ordered Israel to ensure its forces did not commit acts of genocide in Gaza, an arms embargo has moved beyond a moral necessity to become a legal requirement. So, William, since 2008, the UK has licensed £574 million of arms to Israel. Are we complicit in the death toll coming out of Gaza right now?
I think all countries that sell arms to Israel have to be considering their position very, very clearly. And yes, I think the UK is complicit. We have a history of arms sales propping up the economy, and we need to really consider the deeper trends here in the way things are going in the world. It is now, as you said, not just a moral necessity, but we actually should be looking at the legality of things. Now that the International Court of Justice has given its provisional thoughts that there is perhaps a genocide going on here, and very specifically that sort of, if you do provide arms for what turns out to be a genocide, then you are absolutely legally complicit. And that is the danger that all these countries face. It's very interesting. Some of the countries that are now speaking out unlike the UK, about what's been going on over the last 24 hours in North Gaza, are amongst those who are selling arms still. And it's got to stop. That's as simple as that.
Thank you. We're now going to turn to domestic issues. Rwanda refugee plan to cost the UK government £1.8 million for each asylum seeker. Rishi Sunak's flagship plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda will cost the taxpayer £1.8 million for each of the first 300 people the government deports to Kigali, the Whitehall's official spending watchdog has disclosed. The overall cost of the scheme stands at more than £500 million, according to the figures released to the National Audit Office. Even if the UK sends nobody to the Central African state, Sunak has signed up to pay £370 million from the public purse over the 5-year deal. The disclosures follow nearly 3 years of refusals by the Prime Minister, Prime Ministers, Home Secretaries and senior Home Office staff to explain the full costs of the deal, citing commercial confidentiality. So far, no asylum seeker has been sent to Rwanda because of the repeated challenges to the scheme under European and UK laws. The Home Office has now agreed to make 2 types of direct payments to the government of Rwanda, auditors said. The UK will pay to the Economic Transformation and Integration Fund, ETIF, which is designed to support economic growth in Rwanda, and make payments to cover asylum processing and operational costs for individuals relocated to Rwanda. The Home Office has paid £220 million into the ETIF since April 2022 and will pay a further amount of £50 million in 2024 to 2025, £50 million in 2025 to 2026, and another £50 million in 2026 to 2027. A 5-year processing and integration package for each relocated person, which covers accommodation, essential items such as food, medical services, education, and other integration programs, has also been agreed, the report said. This will cost up to £150,000, £150,874,000 for each deported person. The figures mean that if the UK sends 300 people to Rwanda, it will cost the taxpayer £490 million under the partnership, an extra £6 million in individual payments, plus £45 million in processing and operational costs over 5 years. The total cost would be £541 million, which works out as £1.8 million per asylum seeker. The Home Office has spent £20 million setting up the Rwanda scheme, which has survived the tenure of 3 Prime Ministers, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. 4 Home Secretaries, Priti Patel, Suella Braverman in 2 separate terms, Grant Shapps and James Cleverly, have overseen the scheme. Officials expect that the $20 million to rise to $28 million by the end of the 2023 to 2024 period, the report said. The Home Office estimates that it will incur further costs between now and the end of the scheme. William, is it about time Rishi Sunak accepts that the Rwanda scheme is not value of money for the taxpayer?
In a sensible world, yes, he would, and he should have done a long time ago. The full madness of this scheme, from a financial sense alone, is laid bare by this report, and the fact that it's actually a futile symbolic gesture and really little more than that, that'll touch 1% of asylum seekers in any case. And in terms of money, there's no way over time it saves money, even of keeping them in hotels. You would be much better advised putting your money, as I've said repeatedly, into having an asylum system that's fit for purpose and reaches its decisions quickly and executes those decisions in partnership with other countries in a civilized and proper fashion, rather than effectively having this frightening deterrent that doesn't even work, of sending people to Rwanda at, as it's turned out, ridiculously high costs on terms favourable to Rwanda in all circumstances, and it seems favourable to the UK in no circumstances. So it needed review a long time ago. I don't know what the incoming government, if it's a Labour government, will do about it, but I would imagine they would scrap it rapidly, because if they're looking at the money, and that's even before we get into the morality of it, then it's a slam dunk for them to free funds for other things. It's simply crazy, and I'm amazed it still lives on despite having the stake put through its heart several times.
Thank you very much. We're now going to turn to Russia, where the funeral of Alexei Navalny takes place in Moscow. Defying the Kremlin's warnings of arrests, thousands of mourners have gathered in Moscow to bid farewell to the opposition leader Alexei Navalny, 2 weeks after Vladimir Putin's most prominent critic died in the Arctic prison. Crowds of people chanted "Putin is a murderer" and "No to war" as they marched under heavy police presence to the Borovsky cemetery, where Navalny was lowered into the ground on Friday to the strains of Frank Sinatra's "My Way." The public show of support turned to Navalny's last journey into a rare display of dissent in Russia at a time of unprecedented repression. To loud applause and chants of Navalny, the hearse carrying his coffin arrived at the Quench My Sorrows church in the Marino district, where the late politician used to live before he was poisoned with Novichok nerve agent in 2020. Navalny's mother, Lyudmila, who spent more than a week in Russia's Arctic north to retrieve his body, and his father, Atanoli, were part of the small group of people attending the church ceremony that preceded the burial. Navalny's team published a photograph of the memorial service that showed Navalny's body in an open casket covered in flowers, with his parents sitting by his side. This is an image that should have never existed, a tearful Leonid Volkov, Navalny's longtime ally, said during a live stream of the funeral on Navalny's YouTube channel. After the short religious procession, Navalny's coffin was driven to the Borovsky cemetery and lowered into a freshly dug grave. Footage from the cemetery showed his mother kissing him goodbye for the last time before his face was covered in a white cloth. The family was of the opposition leader, including Yulia, his son Zakhar, daughter Dasha, and his brother Oleg, live outside of Russia and did not attend the funeral. They would risk arrest if they returned to the country. Most of his closest allies, who have been forced to flee Russia after criminal charges against them, are on Moscow's wanted list and would face long-term prison sentences if they set foot in Russia. What does this mean for Russia's democracy, and is there a future for any opposition to be able to take on Putin in the coming years?
Putin's constantly been taking steps to repress any dissent, and you can see why the authorities wanted to bury Navalny in secret, and indeed sort of swithered about giving the body to his mother to deal with, because this is the result. This has now been turned into a great sort of both a lament and also a celebration of dissent throughout even the crowds in Moscow. Now, dissent is easier if there are large numbers of people dissenting, although there are some regimes that can deal even with that, and Russia, I'm sure, is capable of doing so. But Putin can't feel very happy with what he's seen, and it does rather indicate that there is a lot of unhappiness in Russia right now, and maybe Putin's future isn't necessarily as secure as he might like. I suspect he's got a lot of survival in him yet, but it's not a happy country. And, we don't know how many people were chanting uh, the various chants that they did, Russia without Putin and no to war. That's the key one in terms of keeping Ukraine going. But I suspect it was a reasonable number, because if it weren't a reasonable number, they'd have been lifted by the police fairly rapidly, you would think. As for the YouTube channel, through the way the Russians have dealt with it, we've now seen 250,000 people across the world watching it on the YouTube channel, which is supposedly banned and blocked in Russia. I don't know if any of the Russian folks got round that, but they've achieved, the Russian authorities, the exact opposite of what they might have wished to achieve, and they would have done perhaps much better if they just on the assumption that they did do away with Navalny, and we're not quite sure about whether that is true, because we have conflicting reports about that. But it really doesn't seem to have been the right course of action at all. It doesn't do them any good. And well, we will see where things go from here, and particularly if the anti-war feeling in Russia is now the blue touch paper has been lit there.
Thank you. We're now going to turn back to Scotland, where ScotGov is to introduce reduced working week for the healthcare staff. Scottish NHS agenda for changing staff, including nurses, midwives and paramedics, allied health professionals, porters and others, will see a reduction of 30 minutes in their working week from April the 1st this year. The move follows a recommendation from the working group set up to implement a previous commitment to cut the number of working hours as a part of the 2023/24 pay deal. It is one of the number of measures to modernise the NHS Scotland agenda for change system and has been agreed with trade unions. If, due to service pressures, safe staffing or well-being issues, it is not possible for the staff member to receive their 30-minute reduction, they will be recompensated accordingly until such time as their reduction can be accommodated. Other measures agreed include a consistent approach to protected learning time across all NHS Scotland boards, and a defined process for undertaking a review of Band 5 nursing roles, with any Band 5 nursing able to self-apply for a review of their role if they believe they meet the criteria. The change will support NHS Scotland workforce recruitment, sustainability and retention. Health Secretary Neil Gray said, "Our agenda for change systems recognise the value of dedication and hard work of our NHS staff and makes the NHS Scotland an employer of the choice. We expect NHS boards to work in partnership with the trade unions and staff to reduce working weeks. The presence of an opportunity to modernise how staff are rostered and work, ensuring that the NHS Scotland is a leader in flexible and family-friendly working practices. I am grateful to both trade union and employer representatives for working in partnership with us to develop these reforms to help modernise our services." So, William, do you think this is a big enough step to help tackle the burnout that many are feeling in the health sector?
Well, I think it's only the first step. They're trying it with 30 minutes to see how it works out, and then I think there's another set of hours to come that they may be able to implement after that. I think a proper reduction in the working week will almost certainly help to deal with the burnout, but other things can be done to help with burnout, such as, if only we could resource the health service better, we could get more staff, because there are not enough of them there, and that's half the problem. And to an extent, the reduction in the working week may make that worse, possibly. So it's a difficult balance, but it is a symbol or a signal of how well I think the Scottish Government has dealt with the pay crisis in the health service over the last 12 months, to do it largely without any industrial action, particularly on the part of doctors. That's another part of the health service, of course. It's not doctors involved here, but they're working in partnership with the unions and others to reach a proper negotiated settlement that talks about more than just pay. And that is chalk and cheese with what the UK government has been doing in England, certainly, and also I think what the Labour government in Wales has been doing. So, in that sense, I welcome it, and I hope it is a success and doesn't have the negative effects that I alluded to. What would be much better, though, is if what we talked about earlier, which is Stephen Flynn looking for more money for the health service, which is needed throughout the UK, and we'd get in Barnett consequentials. I would like to see that, so we could actually allow the health service to begin to recover from not just the inflationary pressures of the last year, but of course from COVID before that, because it hasn't really ever got back to where it was, and it needs to. The Scottish Government and the health boards here do a tremendous job dealing with their straitened circumstances and continuing to provide probably the best service in most areas within the UK, even if it's worse than it used to be. But it could be so much more. And that's where we need to really be going. But that takes money. And under the current devolution settlement, we just ain't got the money.
Thank you for that. We're now going to turn to another story in Scotland. Gov is beginning its assessments of nominations for new national parks. 5 areas in the Scottish borders, Galloway, Loch Aber, Loch Arway and Tay Forest, are in the running to be Scotland's next national park. The Scottish Government has said that it is committed to designating at least one new national park to join the Cairngorms and the Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park by 2026. Each proposal will now be appraised by the Scottish Government against the published criteria, and further consultation will be held once a preferred site is identified, expecting to be in the summer. Scottish Government Biodiversity Minister Lorna Slater said the Cairngorms and Loch Lomond and the Trossachs Park have shown how valuable national park status can be. Both parks are recognised for their incredible landscapes, their outstanding natural and cultural heritage. National park status has boosted their economies, supported local businesses and engaged communities to make the park work for those who live and work in them. Once we have a site identified, we'll engage again with the people in the area to look at determining things like park boundaries and balancing environmental protections with helping the communities and local enterprise thrive. I want to thank everyone who has worked so positively and proactively with their local communities to discuss and explore local priorities and the opportunities that national park status can bring, including those who ultimately choose not to nominate their area. I look forward to meeting with those who have led the nominations to hear directly from each community what they want to see from becoming a national park. We have a mental health crisis in this country. How do national parks help with improving mental well-being for local communities?
That's an interesting one. I hadn't really considered it. I think national parks should increase all sorts of well-being for local communities, and particularly if they're put in train with the local community consulted and their needs taken into account. And therefore, I think that if the community feels it's benefiting, that is likely to improve all manner of things, including, I would say, mental health. And if you feel you're doing something creative and interesting and worthwhile with your environment, and you're doing it in a collaborative fashion, that will help. But it's only a small amount that it's small difference it's going to make, because there is still a large problem. But it's part of a whole panoply of things that could be done, and it's to be welcomed in its own right because of that, I would say.
And do you have any Scottish parks that you think should be up for nomination?
Oh, well, I think the existing nominees are pretty good. Obviously, I'm interested in the Tay Forest because that's the closest to where I am in Bridge of Erne. So um, I think any of them would be a suitable candidate. But what's important is that what happens with them is very much done in consultation with the community. And there are other things going on in Perth and Kinross that don't really seem necessarily to benefit the community. So I would like to see that sort of redressed or balanced out in some way.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So this is it for this evening. Before I go, I just want to remind you that Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on our generosity, on the generosity of our supporters. Our programme will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have now reached our emergency crowdfunder target of £10,000. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our focus can now move on to securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscribers base and regular funding. Thank you again to our guest, William Duguid. Goodbye and thank you for watching.